think the fundamentalist version of evangelism is let's change government. Let's have presidents that are in charge that can shape the society. But I'm looking at the lives of everyday young people, Gen Xers, who didn't care less about politics, but what they really cared about was relationships. And I thought their perceived needs for real relationships with each other was outweighed by their need for a relationship with Jesus.
Welcome everyone back to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is excellent to have you along, whether you are listening or watching us. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Stu, who's here on the panel with us. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Joel.
That's good. Excellent. Tim is not joining us today, unfortunately. He's having a day off, is that right?
He is having a day off, yes. Very well-earned rest.
Yeah, I agree very much so. It's great. I've been really enjoying the dynamic that Tim has been adding, so I'm going to miss him today.
Yeah, me too. I think Tim's terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. But having said that, I did get a haircut yesterday, so I'm ready to go for this podcast because I am excited about what we're going to talk about. And I'm also excited about your reaction. I want to hear lots of stories because we're going to be talking about the 1990s, which is a very prolific time for you.
It's a great decade, yeah.
Yeah. But as always, we'd like to start with a story or a cultural artefact.
Yes.
And as always, I enjoy the different stories and artifacts that you bring. What have you got today? I think you've got like a combination of the two.
Yes. Well, I was really impressed with Andy Stevens' story on an earlier podcast when he was talking a bit about the 90s, and I thought, what could be a sort of similar sort of story?
You're not trying to try and outdo him, are you?
One up Andy Stevens? No, not at all, not at all. But no, there's no way I could one up that story.
That was a crazy
heard,
story.
I don't know what episode it was on for people who haven't heard it, but it was
probably back of about 5 or 6 episodes.
It was significant. The dude was rock climbing, nearly died.
Late at night,
crazy. Yeah. So it's nothing like that. But it did inspire me for today's cultural artefact because we're looking at the 90s and we're talking about cultural change from the 80s to the 90s. We're talking about Gen X coming into its own. Excuse me. One of the archetypal cultural phenomenons of the 90s was skateboarding.
Yes.
So just in case you're not real familiar with the sport of skateboarding, it basically in its modern form kind of originates from a place called Dogtown and a bunch of guys that called themselves the Z-Boys in California in the early 1970s. But then the sport just continued to mature, I suppose, in the 80s and then into the 90s. But in the 90s, it just took off. It was massive and it became really big, so much so, for example, that skate clothing and style kind of almost took over all the other different styles. I mean, many of us in the Sutherland Shire, in the southern suburbs of Sydney, had been surfers for a long time, and we also skate. A lot of surfers skate, but surfing style kind of determined skating style. But in the 90s, skate clothing, skate shoes, skate style kind of took over surfing even in our area, which was a big thing. So for example, part of the style of skating in the 90s was wearing cargo pants. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the 90s, but really baggy cargo pants. And I don't think I saw anybody wearing jeans for 10 years in the Sutherland Shire. So I did hear rumours in the 90s that Levi's were about to go out of business because of skating. So yeah, it was a big phenomenon. Anyway, to show you a little bit of pop cultural history. I've got some artifacts here for you.
This is why people need to be watching us on YouTube, I think, for this one.
For the listeners, I'm now holding up a skateboard, which is actually a modern skateboard, but it's this is Braden Wall's skateboard, but it's actually a replica, I suppose, or
inspired by an 80s
actually
board.
An 80s board, yeah. Yep. So this is an 80s deck. It's you can maybe we could describe it for the listeners, Joel. It's
sure.
A wider board.
Yeah, wider. I'm not
more colourful.
Yeah. What else? Oh, it's only got the one kick at the back.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, one kick instead of two kicks.
I really
don't know what kicks are. You'll find out in a minute a bit more.
I really don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to skateboarding.
The microphone.
That's all right.
But the kick is this thing at the back here, you see.
The bit that kind of kicks up at the back.
Yeah, so big chunky wheels.
Yep.
And this board was synonymous with the 1980s skate scene and would have been ridden in drained pools all over the world.
Right, yep.
Which was where people used to first start skating bowls. They used to hang around in California apparently looking for a pool in someone's backyard that didn't have any water in it, and then they'd skate in it.
Yep. Now we're moving on to a 90s version. Inspired 90s
I've
version.
got a 90s style skateboard here now. As you said, there's a double kick, and this is also known as a trick board. and it's narrower. The wheels are harder, smaller, and the idea of this is that you can do tricks on it a lot easier, and you can ride bowls and
more synonymous with like kick flips and 360
all
flips,
that sort of
flips
stuff,
and all that stuff. Yep.
Yeah, so that's our artifact for today.
Excellent.
And it demonstrates the difference between the 1980s and the 1990s.
Oh, really?
So the second board is a 1990s board, and the first board is a 1980s board.
Right. So this is a time where you really coming into your own, I suppose, as a person as well. Like, because you're in your early 20s in the 90s, is that right?
Yeah, so I was a teenager in the 80s, and I'm 2 years younger than Kurt Cobain, who was lead singer of Nirvana. So that kind of gives maybe some of our listeners and viewers a bit of an idea. I was 20 in 1988, so I was 22, 23 when Nirvana hit, which Kirk would have been 25, something like that.
Yeah.
And so when grunge music hit, grunge music was sort of the musical style of particularly the mid-90s, early mid-90s, and it was a huge transition from 80s rock and roll. It was massive.
I'm glad that you mentioned being a 20-something, because I found this an excerpt from a Time magazine article from 1990. It came out in July 1990, and they were trying to capture what was going on with that generation that was emerging. And Time was, first of all, whoever was writing the article was struggling to actually come up with a term. You know, we've got baby boomers and all that kind of thing. So they tried to label the demographic the new petulance, which when I said that to you prior to recording,
new petulance. Just imagine us calling ourselves that.
Exactly. But I mean, that would have been probably a way of selling out, was putting a label on yourself at that time.
That's a good point. Yes.
I thought I could read this excerpt and see what your reaction would be. So we've got to remember, this is at the beginning of the 90s, so we'll see if that changes as we go through the podcast today. Yep. So it says, the 20-something generation is balking at work, marriage, and baby boomer values. Why are today's young adults so skeptical? They have trouble making decisions. They would rather hike in the Himalayas than climb a corporate ladder. They have a few heroes, not anthems, and no style to call their own. They crave entertainment, but their attention span is as short as one zap of a TV dial. They hate yuppies, hippies,
and the zap of those TV dials.
Yeah, they hate yuppies.
That modern technology.
Yeah. They hate yuppies, hippies, and druggies. They postpone.
And druggies?
That's what it says.
Oh, okay.
And then they postpone marriage because they dread divorce. They sneer at Range Rovers, Rolexes, and red suspenders. What they hold dear are family life, local activism, national parks, penny loafers.
National parks?
Penny loafers and mountain bikes.
What's a penny loafer?
That's a type of shoe, I think.
Oh, okay. Must be American.
And then the final sentence is, they possess only a hazy sense of their own identity, but a monumental preoccupation with all the problems that the preceding generation will leave them to fix.
There is a whole podcast in that.
Well, we're starting a podcast.
Yes. It's fascinating.
What's your reaction?
Wow.
Is that how you felt at the time?
No.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because I think that was the point that I found. It was they're saying they're trying to capture it, but they really didn't do a great job.
Yeah, it does sound like someone who's an older generation looking down on younger people and trying to define them, which we're all aware of, or guilty of too. Yeah, but I don't know. Maybe we could unpick that by looking at some of the aspects of that.
Well, yeah, but would you rather hike in the Himalayas than climb a corporate ladder?
Well, see, that's the funny thing about it. Like, I never thought about climbing the Himalayas, but I did despise the idea of climbing the corporate ladder. Right. So it's a bit jingoistic, but there's a bit of truth to it.
Why would that be?
Definitely, you don't. Well, again, I mentioned Kurt Cobain earlier. One of the problems for Kurt was he didn't know how to deal with his own success, because he wanted to create music for the sake of creating music and defining himself against the greed of the 80s and the glam bands of the 1980s, like Poison and all bands like that, with all their mullets and their frizzy hair and their
eyeliner,
party anthems, and just singing about nothing really. There was a sense with the grunge movement that came around in the early 90s that there was a questioning of that. It was almost like a reinvigorated punk movement in a way, like the late 70s was a similar kind of vibe. And so there was an anarchism to that era. And there's a really terrific movie actually that kind of highlights some of that nuance, which is called Into the Wild. If you haven't seen that movie, it comes from a really good book about a young guy who actually was the same age as me. And when he finished university, instead of going and working in a bank, he wanted to walk to Alaska. And so the whole movie's about him just trying to escape corporate America, I suppose. So there was a sense in our generation that there was a questioning of the greed is good era of the 1980s, and we wanted to define ourselves against that baby boomer sentimentality of that era, I think. So, yeah, I think that there's some truth in it, but it's a bit of a funny way of expressing it.
Well, I mean, even that greed of the 80s I thought was interesting when it says they sneer at Range Rovers, Rolexes and red suspenders. Now, as someone who has just got into the watch game, I like the idea of Rolexes.
Yeah, see, that's what's interesting and different about us, because, yeah, it would have looked pretentious and try hard.
Especially red suspenders too.
Yeah, well, I've only seen it in movies, but the whole image comes to my mind of the Wall Street stockbroker who's walking around, flaunting his wealth with his Range Rover and his fancy watch and his red suspenders. And yeah, you're talking about the contrast is, again, talking about Kurt Cobain's really helpful, I think, because he would go on stage in his pajamas with a tattered old jumper on and, and a flannel. Like the flannelette shirt became the iconic shirt of choice of most people in the early 90s who followed grunge music. And that was a rejection of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I think that obviously it's some of these things that I found are trying to capture is how much the 90s they were rejecting everything they had been told to do. I mean, a book that I found, which has just come out by an author called Chuck Klosterman, he wrote a book called The 90s, and he defines the 90s as being the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 up until 9/11 in 2001.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And primarily inspired by American culture because he's American, but some of the things that he said about the 90s was really interesting. He said that, like, for example, using Seinfeld as that was a defining way of TV being watched in the 90s. If you missed it, you missed it. But then if you cared about a TV show too much, it wasn't a normal thing to do. So even if you did really care about it, because it was the 90s, you were more likely to claim you didn't even own a television rather than claim that you actually wanted to stop what you were doing and go and watch Seinfeld. Is that the don't careism thing? Is that something that you really noticed, or was it just that was an observation of people at that time?
Yeah, I mean that's again a cultural artifact, isn't it? A comedy show like Seinfeld. There was another TV show called Friends that a lot of people used to watch as well. They're both obviously very American, but then again, a lot of the music that was coming out in the 90s was very American. The style was all American. Skateboarding was very American. So Australia was very much now culturally pivoted towards America, as much of the world was. I think that there was a sense where, in Australia we have a thing called the tall poppy syndrome. Yep. It's almost like the tall poppy syndrome got its own decade. So it was almost like, you didn't want to big note yourself. You didn't want to look like you knew what you're talking about too much. That was my experience anyway of the time. There was a cynicism in our generation, which has subsequently come to be known as Generation X. People born from about 1965 to about 1981. People have different definitions, something like that. I was born 1968, so I'd fit into that Generation X. I was a youth leader of an emerging generation that was actually redefining itself against the baby boomers. One of the things that we did used to talk about is the fact that, here's the baby boomer generation who were the hippies of the 1960s who talked about peace and love and dropping out of capitalism, and then they created the 80s, which was one of the most materialistic decades ever. So there was this sense that they were kind of sellouts. And this idea of not wanting to be a sellout was a big thing.
What did you do? Like you're talking about, we've spoken before about you started the Soul Revival in the 90s. Were you
1992,
1992. So were you really aware of like not wanting to look like a sellout? When you were trying to lead young Christians?
It's an interesting question because I think when you're part of a generation, you don't think about it too much. You just actually imbibe what you're part of. And so there was a lot of cultural awareness that I've had since, as I look back on it, as I've thought through some of these things retrospectively. But at the time, I don't think we thought about it much. We just had MTV had just become a big thing in the 80s, and that had still really impacted our generation. Music videos, rock and roll was very, very powerful. Australia had a very prominent role in the rock and roll scene in the 80s, a little less so in the 90s, but there was still this passion that many young people had for rock and roll. And I mentioned the skateboarding phase, like it was like people were looking for alternative things. So alternative music became more popular than mainstream rock and roll. So we would see bands like Poison, Guns N' Roses, in my subculture as a say an 18-year-old, I'd see those things as super daggy and wasn't into it. Mullet haircuts, which are making a bit of a resurgence at the moment. Yep. We thought that was the height of just super, not going to do that. We started growing our hair long in the early 90s, and the grunge era was all about this sense that we were asking important questions that other generations hadn't asked, which was a bit presumptuous, I think. But there was the Generation X were the first generation to have experienced divorce in a big way as well. So a lot of young people came from families where their mum and dad had got divorced, and so we were trying to grapple with that. We're also grappling with the fact that consumerism actually didn't give a lot of answers that it promised. And actually in the Sutherland Shire, during the 1990s, when I was a youth leader and youth minister, the 1990s in the Sutherland Shire, we had the highest rates of youth suicide in the whole world.
Wow. And
yet the Sutherland Shire was a very prosperous, materialistic area. So that's kind of the idea that there's just not, you just don't find happiness in popularity. So I think as other artists looked in on our generation, I remember hearing that In Excess had a bit of a crisis because they were a massive pop band in the 1980s, and then when grunge came along, they went, how do we do this? A lot of hair metal, as we used to call it, just disintegrated within a year or two as soon as grunge came along. It just didn't look substantial anymore. So I think for us, the grunge movement, skateboarding, alternative stuff was almost like a victory of the alternative subculture that we were longing for. Instead of wearing, I know this sounds funny now, but instead of wearing white sneakers and faded denim jeans, we used to opt for cargo pants and Doc Marten boots, and we were in the late 80s we were trying to look for a new direction. We're following bands like the Pixies, for example, who were influential on Nirvana, and so when Nirvana came along, a lot of us who had been listening to alternative music during the late 80s were really excited that, oh, now this is breaking into the mainstream, what's this going to happen? And I think that's what grunge music did. It sort of broke that alternative subculture into the mainstream.
Yeah, that's a really good way of summing up, I think. And then also Chuck Closeman said that the 90s life was an adversarial relationship with the unseemliness of trying too hard. So you didn't want to appear like you knew too much.
Yeah, people were called tryhards if they tried too hard. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I mean there was other stuff in that quote that he had, but I think that sort of, for me, summarises some of it.
Yeah, it was really good. So I thought it'd also be worth just we talked about the a number of episodes. We've talked about the fundamentalists, evangelicals, and modernists, and I thought we could do a quick flyover in terms of the what was actually happening in terms of that, especially in the US. And I think we have focused on the US quite a bit because that has been, I mean, during this time that we're covering right now, between perhaps the 60s and the 2000s, they've been a very influential. They're probably the only superpower around that time. So
well, that's right. I mean, we had the Cold War before the fall of the Berlin Wall, so it was a competition between the USSR, China, and America. Yes. But now, after the USSR tore down the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall came down, USSR ceased to exist, and now there was Russia rather than USSR, and so it did look like America had reached its zenith, and there was this sense that, wow, this is now going to be this new era of peace and prosperity. It was probably the American decade. So when grunge music comes in, when Generation X are questioning America and its power through its financial prosperity, it's quite an interesting thing. That so at the same time as America has pretty much won the Cold War, Generation X are rejecting a lot of the values of the Cold War
and influencing a lot of people outside of that as they're doing. Yeah,
interesting.
Well, I mean, in terms of the moral majority we spoke about last episode, that they kind of met their downfall towards the end of the 80s, and that was shut down. A new kind of emerging area was the Christian Coalition, which became the largest Christian right organisation, which was led by a person called Pat Robertson. They actually focused less on mobilising churches than more on lay people and making connections with other Christian right groups. And that Pat Robertson, who was the president of that organisation, said, "We want to see a majority of the Republican Party in the hands of pro-family Christians by 1996." So it was the next moral majority in a sense. So even by 1997, which they considered the peak of the Christian Coalition, they had 1.9 million members and a budget of $27 million. So again, that's that thing of having a real desire to influence public policy and in a political way that we have termed and uses George Marsden's definition of being fundamentalist. It's interesting again that group met the same kind of downfall as the moral majority once Bill Clinton was re-elected in 1996, and they were actually left dismayed that Clinton had been re-elected even after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So there was a lot. They were left in disarray until George Bush Jr. took over, and he actually spoke of being born again. And he quit alcohol, joined a Bible study. So they obviously rallied around him. With all that going on in terms of, they like to term that the Christian right, where do you see that fitting in within the broader, we talk about the evangelical line of throughout history. How do you see that matching up with that?
Yeah, so a really important issue for us in this season is we're asking the question, whatever happened to evangelism? And what we've been trying to unpack over quite a few episodes is that if you go back and look at the history of the Protestant church as it emerges from the Reformation, you see a splintering of the Protestant church into some pretty broad categories, and it's very complicated and you can't oversimplify it, but for the sake of the podcast, we've summarised some of Protestant history in terms of a line of evangelicals that we've called them that have gone out of the Protestant Reformation. Evangelicals are called evangelicals because they take their authority from Scripture, and so the word evangelical actually comes from the Greek word in the Bible, evangelion, which means good news. So the good news Protestants are Protestants who, like Luther, have got their authority from the Word of God in the Bible, and so that influences their evangelism. So the evangelism of Protestant evangelicals has been to preach the gospel, preach the good news, preach the evangelion, and so they'll continue to preach the gospel into a changing context around the world. And we've argued in this podcast that there's been a line of evangelicals that have gone through the last 400 years that we've kind of broadly traced, and now we're sort of focusing a little bit more as we're coming up to our era. But that evangelical tradition has influenced the way we evangelize today, if we still consider ourselves to be evangelicals. However, we talked about the fact that soon after the Reformation and the evangelicals came along, there were great awakenings, and the success of the evangelical evangelism. And by the way, let's make a distinction between evangelical and evangelism. Some Christians get confused by that. Evangelical is Bible-believing Christians. Evangelism is Bible-believing Christians sharing their good news with other people. So the evangelism that comes from evangelicals is of a certain flavour. It's very, as we've talked about, it's very much about giving someone an individual choice to become a Christian. So that you're not just a Christian because you're part of a big group, like, say, some Catholic traditions might teach that if you get baptised as a Catholic, you're a Christian. Whereas the evangelicals would say, well, you need to make a personal decision for Christ. And so that evangelical line has gone through history, and as we've said on the podcast, our church, Soul Revival, is an evangelical church, and we still consider ourselves to be that. But over time, there have been great revivals and awakenings of that tradition, but at the same time, there's also been the ongoing enlightenment and scientific questioning of the supernatural. And we've talked in previous episodes that reason and faith have sometimes been in conflict during the history of this timeline. And so some evangelicals actually started to think more about, does science actually give us a critique of the Bible? And so liberal Christians or modernist Christians, particularly influenced by German theologians in the 1800s and the 1900s, started to question whether the Bible was that authoritative. And so that has actually caused some liberal Christians to be actually more looking for a historical Jesus within the text. Is the text actually historical, or is it actually just a faith-based community work that is promulgating the values of a faith community, or did these things actually happen? So that modernist line is now continuing through history after the 1700s, 1800s. But then what we find at the 1900s is a group of evangelicals who are concerned by these modernist liberals, really want to go back to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, which we'd all say, as evangelicals, we'd all say are really important. But they actually became more politically active to try and create more of a state-based response to this. So this reached its zenith in 1928 with the Scopes monkey trial, when some fundamentalists, they called themselves, took some scientists to court to try and stop evolution being taught in schools in America. And so that was a really big public defeat for those fundamentalists. But while those fundamentalists were arguing politically for a Christian worldview, there are still just evangelicals who are continuing just to preach the gospel and not get too politically active. And we talked about people like J.O. Packer, John Stott in the 1950s. We talked about Philip Jensen in the 1980s. John Chapman. You know, there are evangelicals that are continuing just to preach the gospel. And what I think is interesting in the 1990s is, as those groups are forming in America with the religious right, which some people are calling them evangelicals, but we talked last week about Marsden would classify someone who's a politically active evangelical as a fundamentalist. So evangelicals still hold to the fundamental truths of Scripture, but they don't get involved politically to try and change the world politically. They actually want to actually go through that line of history of evangelicals and keep preaching the gospel. And what's really interesting about that in the 1990s is there are still fundamentalists who are getting angry at some of the cultural changes that are taking place. I think they've missed, in some cases, that Christendom is coming to an end, you know, that era of state and faith being linked. I also think that there's an unawareness of what's happening amongst a lot of young people, that a lot of young people are actually rejecting the faith of their parents in larger and larger numbers. That was, for me, really summarised by the R.E.M. song Losing My Religion that came out in the early 90s, you know, that there's this idea that our generation is losing its religion. We're not only cynical towards materialism and our parents, we're also, the generation was searching for some more deeper answers, I think. And there was a sense that the 80s was very plastic and it was very mass-produced and it was very cynical. And we were looking, I think, for something deeper, more community-orientated, something that had deeper relationships. And what was really interesting about that is people were finding that in lots of different places, because we were the product of what we now call postmodernism, which is a more eclectic, diverse community. You know, as I said, there's skaters, there's surfers, there's people who listen to grunge music, there's people who listen to other kinds of music. There was still pop music being produced in the 90s as well, which we, again, those of us that listen to grunge music really despise that kind of stuff. But I remember, what was that girl band from England? Spice Girls. Yeah, Spice Girls, that sort of stuff was like, yeah, no. So that was still being produced. But yeah, there's this eclectic generation of lots of different people. And I think while fundamentalists are trying to organise a group response to the changes in culture, on the ground there are evangelicals that are ministering to young people who are actually more interested in that evangelical line of history, that are just interested in preaching the gospel. And that came to a real head for me in the early 90s, because when I was at university, I'd studied political science, and I had this real personal struggle thinking to myself, is the way to make the world a better place by being involved in politics, or is the way to be involved in making the world a better place by being just a Christian evangelical who preaches the gospel? And it really came to a head for me, because I was doing a PhD at University of New South Wales in the early 90s, and I was looking at the history of Christian youth ministry, actually trying to work out why so many young people were losing their religion, as I've experienced through the 80s and more so in the 90s, early 90s. And my supervisor actually came to me one day and said, Stuart, you know, you've got this youth group you've started at the same time as your PhD study, and the youth group's getting bigger and bigger and taking more and more of your time, because by the time 1992, 1993, all of a sudden Soul Revival started to explode. We started with 4 people, but all of a sudden there's heaps of these inquiring Gen Xers that are really enjoying what we're doing. And my PhD supervisor said, well, you've either got to be Mother Teresa or write about Mother Teresa. You can't be both. And I just remember thinking, I'd been reading Marsden about fundamentalism and thinking, no, I just don't feel like that's the future of Christian witness. I think the fundamentalist version of evangelism is let's change government. Let's have presidents that are in charge that can shape the society. But I'm looking at the lives of everyday young people, Gen Xers, who didn't care less about politics, but what they really cared about was relationships. And I thought their perceived needs for real relationships with each other was outweighed by their need for a relationship with Jesus. And so I got super convicted that day when my supervisor said, "Are you going to write about Mother Teresa or be Mother Teresa?" I said, "It's time to be Mother Teresa." So I just walked away from my PhD, and I walked away from political science, and I decided not to be fundamentalist and actually be an evangelical who was preaching the good news. So yeah, that for me was the journey, and that personal story, I hope, kind of helps to sharpen that difference and that distinguishing character between fundamentalism and evangelicalism.
It was really, to exactly to that point, just in a little bit of research when I was looking at the Christian right, Al Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, seemed to maybe start trying to move at least his organisation kind of a little bit away from being so political. So he actually wanted to train future pastors to interpret the culture, and he does say to stand against it, which would probably be a little bit more fundamentalist, but he said rather than engage so politically, we should train the future pastors to interpret the culture. Was that your experience as well, as you were obviously just started Soul Revival? Do you feel like you needed to understand the culture at the time, or that's because you were in the culture that there wasn't really a need to do that?
Yeah, I was young enough to still be part of what was happening in the culture, and I don't think I had to understand it. I was just inviting it, I think, and we just had some decisions to make around how to have successful solutions to some of the problems we were coming up with on the ground in the local church. And so I'm really encouraged by the work of Mark Center III that we've come back to a number of times, and he wrote a book in the early 90s called The Coming Revolution of Youth Ministry. And in that book he says two interesting things. First of all, he says we live in times of constant cultural change. Rather than just trying to fight against that cultural change, which is what I think fundamentalists can tend to do, we should actually come up with new evangelistic strategies that we can have during that cultural change. So we need to keep the same biblical truths, but continue to work out how to communicate those and contextualize those into each new generation. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I got from him was that during times of cultural change, it's almost always young people and people who work with them that come up with new solutions to do that. And so that was the genesis in the early 90s. That book was the genesis in my thinking for the shock absorber, that we need to bring young people and older people together. And originally it was like I was leading a group of 16, 17-year-olds, 4 or 5 of them to start off with, and we just thought, let's work as a team and let's be friends with each other. That was our impulse, and it was a very Gen X impulse to be friends with each other. Some people have sort of, because we do talk about being friends at Soul Revival a lot, and some people say, why do you use that ecclesial category of friendship rather than family or being a spiritual house or being built into a wall or being a body? Now, we do teach at Soul Revival all those ecclesial categories, but one thing we recognised in the early 90s, which would be interesting to see if our viewers and listeners have ever seen this kind of phenomenon, but to actually call ourselves a family almost gave young Gen Xers an excuse not to be in deep relationship with one another, because in our context with family breakdown going through our generation so strongly, there was a lot of young people who saw family as something you kind of had to do, and there was a lot of young people that would think, my family is who I get together with at Christmas, and I don't even know them really, but I see them once or twice a year. So even though it is a very deep ecclesial category, and it still remains so for many people today, and even in that time, family was important to a lot of people. But what I think was a category that was really helpful was we were thinking through how Jesus had said, I no longer call you my servants, but my friends, and you're my friends if you do what I say, which is to love one another. And it's not like we stopped calling ourselves a family, but we did really lean into that teaching of Jesus and say, what does it look like to be friends with Jesus? And what does it look like to then be friends with each other and love one another as Jesus has taught us to love and is teaching us to love? So that idea of friendship really struck a chord with Gen Xers who were looking for meaningful relationships, because as we preached about family, they were hearing that as, well, we come to church and we just be pleasant strangers with each other, like my family has become to me. But my real relationships are with my friends. And we mentioned that TV show Friends because that was a real big cultural moment in the 90s. Friendship was really important to a lot of people. And particularly for young people who were going through a lot of pain and a lot of questioning. I mean, I remember talking to one girl at Soul Revival in the early 90s, and she said, I love Nirvana. I love listening to Pearl Jam. I just love grunge music. And I said, oh yeah, why do you love grunge music so much? And she said, when I listen to Nirvana, I feel alone, but I feel alone with everybody else who's alone.
Okay.
And I think that sort of, for me, captures the zeitgeist of that moment.
Right. That's a really interesting way to think about it, though, that we're all alone together. Yeah, wow. Okay. You talked about relationships, and as you said before, that we talk about this season in particular is about evangelism. What were the new kind of ways of coming up with actual ministry to actually deal with these kind of cultural issues? Because I mean, one of them is relational ministry, which I think is something we should definitely talk about, because that emerged around that time. Yeah,
so Mark Center was at the forefront of relational youth ministry at the time in the early 90s, with other contemporaries like Pete Ward, who had written about incarnational ministry, which, as you'll know from earlier episodes, we can trace right back to the 1950s with what's his name again? Jim Rayburn, sorry, yeah. So Jim Rayburn first started thinking through how important relationships were to people in the second half of the 20th century. And in the 1950s, he was super influenced by contemporaries like Billy Graham, who were really preaching that evangelical message that you need to have a personal relationship with Jesus. Jim Rayburn in the 1950s noticed that because of the advent of high schools, teenagers were now being able to choose their own friends and not just be friends with the people their parents had chosen for them. And so this whole idea about who was in and who was out, how do you form relationships, Jim Rayburn really sort of took a Christian look at that and helped individuals to think through the fact that if they became a Christian, they were having a relationship with Jesus as a friend. You know, I think that was one of the earlier takes on that. But one of the things that Jim Rayburn noticed is that a lot of teenagers in the late 50s, 1960s, and this would go on for more youth leaders, was that young people were becoming defined as against their parents. So the baby boomers defined themselves as a generation against their parents. And I suppose Gen X were now, my generation, were defining ourselves against our baby boomer parents and their parents. But what was really significant there is that Jim Rayburn was seeing that to do ministry to young people was almost like a cross-cultural ministry, that if you were going to step into their cultural world, which was different to the parents' cultural world, you need to have symbols that they had, like wear the same kind of clothes, listen to the same kind of music. He and other contemporary incarnational theologians talked about earning the right to be heard. Before you could preach the gospel to someone, you needed to start a relationship with them. So in the 80s, there was this big focus from people like Pete Ward and Mark Center about getting into young people's spaces, like hanging out at the mall, hanging out at skate parks and stuff, to talk to young people, get to know them, and when they trusted you, then share the gospel with them. And that was this idea that Jesus had come to be to bring Jesus had come to the Jews to bring the kingdom to the Jews, and so Jesus had become a Jew to the Jews kind of idea. And so the idea from incarnational circles in the 80s and 90s was, well, just like Jesus became a Jew to bring the good news to the Jews, we should become a skater to bring the good news to skaters. So a lot of youth ministries just built skate ramps in their halls and started hanging out with skaters. But the problem with that was that when you affirm a culture, there comes a time where you do need to confront that culture with the problem of sin. So if you've been embracing the culture of skating and grunge, then at some point you need to bring into that story the fact that we are all sinners and we need a saviour. And so early on, I struggled with that incarnational model, and I started thinking, actually, if I'm evangelical and I'm bringing the good news, then preaching is a really important part of being an evangelical. And evangelism isn't just about trying to create a culturally relevant message and earning the right to be heard, but it's more about being in the culture with my generation, but then actually proclaiming the gospel. So what are some ways I could do that? And so early on in my ministry, I was really struck actually that I got an invitation to go and do scripture at the local high school, at Kirrawee High School. And I remember walking up to Kirrawee High School for the first time, and I had a Bible in my hand, and I was walking up to the school, going up to sign in or whatever before I went to the room that I was supposed to teach in. And because we have voluntary scripture in state schools in Sydney, in Australia, and we get the opportunity to come in and speak to people in schools, which was terrific. But as I was walking in, I was kind of a bit nervous, because I remembered in the 80s when scripture teachers used to come to Kirrawee High School, they used to get completely trashed by many of the students. And I was a bit nervous, and I'm walking in, and then I thought to myself, Kurt Cobain gets up on stage and just says what he wants and sings what he wants. He doesn't try and be the Spice Girls to get people to buy his records. He just sings his message. And I'm like, I really believe in the Word of God. I really believe in my message. And the interesting thing for me was that I thought grunge music wasn't just about the sound, it was about the message. And it was authentically coming from the grassroots in Seattle, and it had spread around the world because it was so authentic, and it had come from the grassroots, and it meant something. And so I got really encouraged that actually Christianity has an even more powerful message than grunge music. And I have the Word of God, and this has been inspired by the Holy Spirit. And as I share this message, then this is a spiritual endeavor. It's not even just a cultural competition between, who's right wing and left wing, or whatever
who's
it is,
cool
or who's not cool.
Who doesn't care? Or
so just like Kurt Cobain didn't care about looking cool or not going on stage and made that cool, I thought, I'm just going to go in and be confident about this message and share this message with these young crew. And to my surprise, heaps and heaps of young people just went, wow, this is fantastic. We love this. This is really refreshing. And this is what we're looking for. We're looking for what surprised a lot of young people was they weren't just looking for relationships with other people. They were actually looking for a relationship with God. And I think even though they didn't realize it, many through the decade of the 90s, I was so surprised that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teenagers through the 90s became Christians. And it was like a mini revival at one stage. We went from 4 kids to 500 kids in about 7 years coming to our youth group. And 80% of them were from non-Christian backgrounds. And I literally sat with hundreds of young people as they gave their life to Jesus during the 90s. And it wasn't because I'd earned the right to be heard. It's just I presented the simple message of the gospel in a way that they could understand. And
invited a response too, right?
Invited a response.
Because that's something we've spoken about in the series as well.
It is, yeah. And we have talked about it in other episodes, but one of the young people in our group brought these Jesus beads to youth group one night on Soli's on a Saturday night. I mean, don't get me wrong, we had done some cultural things that would help young people to feel comfortable. For example, we realised that the architecture of our church just didn't have any lounge rooms, didn't have any place that encouraged people to sit around and talk and have a feed, whereas our generation wanted to do that. We didn't just want to go to an event, we wanted to be present with each other.
Build a relationship.
Yeah, so we just ended up asking some member of the church if we could use their garage, and got some lounges off a council cleanup, which is where people put the furniture out to be collected by council when they don't want it. And we got some of those lounges, let off a cockroach bomb in a garage, and we started meeting in a garage. And then we met in a disused church, and so on and so on. But so we did do some things like that were helpful. But at the core of it was, our young people come up with these Jesus beads, which was green, white, black, red, yellow. Yeah, thanks, Joel. And these beads were just a really simple gospel, biblical theology, actually, that we just used to tell the gospel by using those colours. And it just helped kids to go, oh yeah, I kind of get that. That makes sense. And then having a conversation with them about that, it was a pretty exciting thing to see that just like grunge hit globally, Soul Revival hit locally in a way that we didn't expect. It was very exciting.
And do you think that one of the reasons for that was because we spoke about the 90s generation looking for meaning? Is that because those guys were looking for meaning?
I think that was part of it, yeah. I think the meaning we were offering as Christian youth leaders in the 90s was very exciting for many young people. Yeah, I mean, I've seen lots of people respond to Christ in a group, but also in a really meaningful way. Just young people one-on-one in a conversation, talking and realising that actually Jesus is real and he is alive. And if he rose from the dead, I can rise from the dead too. And like I said, the suicide rate in the Shire was going through the roof at the time. So people were looking for hope, and the gospel gave them hope. Yeah.
That suicide statistic always really hits me in the face. So it really, really saddens me sometimes. Anyway, sorry. But I mean, it's great that you were able to cut through that and be able to speak to people in a plain message of Jesus, which is what that evangelical line really marks out. It's like, let's preach the good news.
Let's get to the basics and preach. And that message of hope literally saved some young people's lives. We were involved with actually literally saving 2 young women's lives who attempted suicide, but they reached out to us in the middle of that attempt, and we were able to get in touch with their parents and authorities, get them to hospital. So there was a great deal of love and trust that was built up in a community that was centered on the message of Jesus.
Yeah, that's really lovely to hear. One thing that I did want to just come back to you, but you talked about being, we talk about that evangelical line, and what seems to be coming out often is, and I wanted to see what your thoughts are on this, that we need to understand what's going on in the culture, but it's also the fact that evangelicals are willing to adjust and come up with new ways of ministering. Do you think that, like, we look over the course of history, do you think that is one of a key marker of being an evangelical in comparison to, say, a fundamentalist who continues to go on, we need to have the fundamentals of the Bible, yes, which evangelicals agree with, but then also we need to keep what existed previously?
Yeah. I might be wrong on this, Joel, but my impression of fundamentalists is they want to maintain the cultural expression of the Christian witness that was of a previous generation, which is not always that necessary. And I don't think you have to compromise the gospel and values to do that. A good example of how we came up with new ideas was literally, I was originally working with a youth minister that was leading me, Andrew Callow, and Andrew had come up with this great idea of, instead of just going up and doing scripture in the schoolroom or doing a lunchtime group at lunchtime in a schoolroom at the school, he approached the school to ask if he could run a breakfast. And he ran the breakfast at a science lab. I still remember going along, and he invited me to come, and we set up a toaster and just cooked toast, and kids had come to this breakfast and we just sit around and talk. It was the early 90s, and that's how it rolled. Now, Andrew was only around for a year, and I got on with Andrew really well. He was a surfer. He drove a combi van. I thought he was terrific. And so that was a lot of fun. I actually bought his combi van after he did leave. Yeah, right. He wanted to sell his van when he left our church, and I bought it, and that was my first car that I bought for myself. So I've been driving combi vans for 30 years since, but I'm only on my second one too. So yeah, anyway, but Andrew, before he did leave Guymar Anglican, he set this new idea up, and I think what that did for me is it gave me a feeling that we could have permission to try new things. So before I'd even read Centre that said that young people come up with new ideas, Andrew was showing me that you can actually have a think about it and be creative and think of new ways of doing things. So he wasn't changing the Bible when he did the Bible study at that breakfast, because he'd open the Bible and read the Bible, but just somehow having toast and Vegemite or peanut butter or honey, it was just really fun. It was just different, and it's simple as. Now, when Andrew left, I thought, I'd like to do that at lunchtime, and I thought, instead of doing it inside, maybe I might try and do it out on the playground where all the kids are. So again, I just approached the school and I said, could I do the lunchtime group and move it out onto the grass? And they said, yeah, sure, you can do that. And so there was a lot of freedom from the school to do that. And we would get a group of, say, 12 or 15 Christians out on the school grass. And because we couldn't get a lead and get a toaster out onto the grass, I thought, what else can I do? I might just buy some hot chips. And I didn't buy the hot chips to try and attract kids to come to it. It was more like what Andrew had set up with the toaster and the bread. And it was just something to do while we're talking, because it's a very human thing to have a meal together. And so we were having chips out on the grass for the first half of lunch, and then I'd give a talk for the second half of lunch. It's super simple. Now, some critics of that approach have labelled that bait and switch, that we're trying to get kids for the chips, and then, but the teenagers weren't dumb. They knew we were Christians. They knew we were coming to teach the Bible. We weren't trying to trick them or anything. And they were really actually quite respectful. They weren't coming over trying to, get chips. They were just saying, I'm really interested to see what you guys are on about. And we'd say, do you want to have some chips? And they'd go, oh, no, we're not part of the group. We don't feel like we have a right to have chips. And we're like, you can share some if you want. But the good thing about being on the grass is young people could stand around on the outside and listen to what we were talking about without joining it, and just have a think about it. And slowly, more and more, by the end of the 90s, we had probably 150 kids a week coming to that chip lunch, we called it. And then that started out in lots of other schools around the place. But another thing we did is, instead of just running a youth group on Friday night, because of our desire for a relationship, we thought, we're very influenced by Matthew 22:37-40, and we thought, there Jesus says, love God and love others. And it really convicted us, because we didn't really love others as much as we probably could. We really loved Jesus, but even then we were sort of giving Jesus what was left over after we'd done all the other things that we want to do, like part-time jobs, study, sport, whatever it was. But we thought, wouldn't it be great if instead of running a youth group, we were a peer group? And so we bring the kids up into that peer group. So I said to the group of youth leaders in the early 90s, what if we start hanging out on Saturday night, not as another church event, but just hang out as friends? And then as the kids get older and they turn 18 or, even younger, they could say 17 or whatever, they can come and start hanging out with us on Saturday night. And so that too was a new idea. And a lot of Christians went, oh, that's, wasting a lot of time at church. But we thought, well, we're a peer group, we're friends around Jesus. And we were really excited to read the Bible and then just do stuff friends would do. So we'd have a read of the Bible at a cafe and then go see a movie, or we'd have a read of the Bible and order pizza, or just do the things we'd normally do socially. But we also had a read and we had a pray and we talked about being Christian. And it was really cool because one of the fun experiments was, as young adults, we just decided not to drink on Saturday night so that younger people could be a part of that. And it was a really countercultural thing, and it grew into a really popular thing. And that Saturday night hangout is now 30 years old. Young adults have been hanging out at Soul Revival for 30 years now. And every Saturday night, there's a group of young adults at Soul Revival that hang out with each other because they're mates. And so that doesn't mean they're not a family as well. They are, but they're actually gathering as friends. And I think that's very organic. And what's really cool is, even though Gen X is now, I'm 53 now, so I'm not young at all, a young adult at all now, but I still see young adults who are of younger generations than me, still resonating with that expression of, I love Jesus, and because I love Jesus, I'm going to love you as he loves you. And so I'm committed to Jesus, I'll be committed to you too. And it's forming really beautiful friendships that in some cases being lifelong.
And it feels like what you're saying there, it fits with the evangelical line of history. Is like they're the fundamental truths of the Bible, and we want to express that. But then you also seem to have understood what was going on in the culture, and people were looking for the meaning of we just need to be friends with each other. And but then also the freedom of expressing those new ideas in new ways that would fit at the time. But then that doesn't mean we need to stick with those ideas for forevermore.
And some people looked at what we were doing and thought it was incarnational, because there was a whole bunch of surfers hanging out. Oh, wow, you've got a really good incarnational ministry to surfers and skaters, which we did. We had a lot of grunge fans. We had people, you come to Soul Revival and people playing Pantera and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all those different bands that were playing. We'd have concerts and fun nights where we'd just go nuts and mosh. I think actually we were the first bunch of Christians in Sydney to mosh. There was a festival called Black Stump and we all used to mosh at Soul Revival every week, and we went along to this conference, Black Stump conference thing, and they had a band play, so we all moshed. And to start off with, everyone was like, what the blazes is going on there? But that was kind of fun. But music styles change, young people change, and if you're in a relationship with other people, you change with it. I mean, back when we were moshing and had a lot of punks come along and all that kind of stuff, Michael Frost actually wrote an article about incarnational ministry, and in that article mentioned that Soul Revival was the best incarnational ministry that he'd seen. But we all had a bit of a giggle at that because we didn't think we were incarnational. Not giggle at Michael at all, but it was interesting that we were seen as incarnational when actually what we were doing is being very evangelical. So I like to think that what we were doing was so focused around the Bible that we weren't trying to earn the right to be heard. We were just preaching the gospel in our culture, which some people might come back at us, and through the comments feel free to say that's incarnational. But a good example of the difference, I think, is there's a church down the road from Soul Revival that would have had probably a couple of hundred young people coming every week and had a skate ramp, but the majority of those young people weren't Christians, and as a result the Christians really struggled to get a Christian culture to really impact those young people. In contrast, we'd have a couple of hundred young people come along to a concert where we might have a Christian band come along and play, but instead of just saying it was a concert, come along and then jump up with a message, we'd say, we're a Christian community, Soul Revival. You all know us. We're around at the school. You've seen our Jesus beads. We're inviting you to come along to a night where we're going to have a band play, and if you want to come, you're super welcome. And halfway through, after the first set, I'd jump up on stage and I'd grab a Bible and I'd say, okay, we're going to have a read, and probably 15 to 20% of the group would all just sit down ready to have a listen. Some of the young crew had even brought their Bibles with them. So all the non-Christian crew that were there would all look around and go, oh, I think the thing you do here is you sit down and you have a listen, and people would have a listen. And then I could go on for 20, 30 minutes and people would be stoked. And then after we finished the talk, sometimes people become Christians. And it wasn't like a bait and switch where people had come for the concert and then been surprised by a message. It was more like, yeah, we know you guys are Christians, and this is part of what you do in your community, in your friendship group. Just like we know that surfers go surfing together or skaters go skating together, Christians, they read the Bible together. That's what Soul Revival became known for.
And in terms of expressing the new ideas, we kind of looked at an international focus for the US and what was happening around then. We looked at kind of the local, talking about Soul Revival. I was just trying to think about how we had Andy Stevenson on the podcast a few episodes ago, as you mentioned earlier, and he mentioned the youth ministry discussions. You've actually termed the youth ministry wars.
Yeah, I did.
What about a national level, or at least a New South Wales level? What was going on there in terms of evangelism?
Well, yeah. Well, I think again, if you think of those different categories, there are liberal Christians that are probably de-emphasising doctrine in their evangelism. So they're not wanting to offend people with Christian doctrine and form relationships. I'm being very broad here. You've probably got charismatic ministries like Youth Alive, I think was one of them at the time. Hillsong was big, where they'd have big concerts and kids would go to it. And that was very much focused. Evangelism was very much focused on the music. And then within mainline groups, there was a lot of discussion on how to do youth ministry and a lot of exploration. Well, we're in the Anglican Church in Sydney mainly, but it did impact a lot broader. In the late 1980s, a book came out called No Guts, No Glory, and Ken Moser, Al Stewart, and Ed Vaughan wrote that book. And Ken Moser particularly became a real advocate for that book, and his view was that the youth ministry models of the 1970s that had been prominent in the 80s kind of run out of steam. The idea of having a youth group on Friday night where you have 40 kids come along, hardly any of them come for the Bible, and then when you try and fit the Bible in, they don't listen. He called it a dump truck approach. It's almost like this church had this big dump truck full of teenagers back into the driveway at the beginning of the night, dump all these kids out. You know, the youth leaders do games with them, do a talk, and then give them some cordial and biscuits, and then the dump truck comes in and they all pile on and then they go again. Well, I don't want to do disjustice to Ken's model, but No Guts, No Glory was kind of saying what's happening is those groups are set up for perceived needs of relationship rather than real needs of meeting Jesus through the Word of God. And he said, if you've got guts, what you do is close down your Friday night group and start a Sunday afternoon Bible study. And you'll actually have most of the kids leave the church, and that's why you need guts to do it. But you'll have 4 or 5 kids that really love Jesus and really love the Bible. They'll come along. And instead of having a dump truck model, or what used to be known as a funnel model, where you get lots of people come into the youth group and then funnel down into Bible study, he said, let's just go for a bead model of evangelism, which is those 4 kids are going to ask their friends one by one, and you'll grow a big youth group that way. So that became a very strongly held model across Sydney, with a lot of evangelical Anglicans adopting that model and actually saying to other churches that have still got games and stuff on a Friday night that actually that's not really the future of youth ministry. Real biblical ministry is this No Guts, No Glory model. So I think that set up a bit of a war, because there were youth groups that either didn't know of this book and hadn't changed, or groups that didn't want to change. And, you know, I had friends that were still in that zone of having a Friday night youth group and saying, actually, we do a lot of discipleship. We do a lot of good Bible. So Janelle Anglican, Castle Hill Anglican were 2 churches that continued on with that Friday night youth group approach. Cameron Hislop from Janelle and Tim Hawkins from Castle Hill were big voices that were saying, actually, there are more than one way of doing youth ministry, not just this No Guts, No Glory. And that's what I think started a bit of a war, because there was this big war of ideas. It wasn't always personal, but sometimes it did get a bit personal, but there was just this big discussion. Now, a war is obviously a bad thing, and, you know, a war of ideas can actually be not a violent process. Like, it wasn't like it was a violent thing or aggressive. It was more people debating which view was right. Whether
and you said it put youth ministry on the map. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I think it did. I mean, it it was actually a creative thing. That's where I suppose I'm struggling to find the words for it. But I think what I'm trying to say is there's a bit of creativity in people trying to argue for different points of view.
And pushing them
and pushing each other. Yeah. So it was a bit more, I don't want to use the word competitive, but it was an environment where people were thinking, and it was almost, there was like, oh, what are we going to do next? And that's why I mentioned that book by Mark Center, because he said now that his book was called The New Revolution in Youth Ministry. He said that the 90s, I think quite accurately, the 90s was going to be a time where there was going to be lots of different approaches, and people were going to be really trying to search out what sort of approach works within a pluralistic culture. So from the American point of view, there were even approaches harking back to traditionalism, and people were looking back to those kind of things. There was incarnationalism, there was music-led evangelism. But yeah, in Sydney there was this big discussion around, do you just do a Bible study, or is it okay to do some stuff on Friday night as well? So Soul Revival was the beginning of because we were looking at being friends on Saturday night, that was the beginning of a intergenerational
approach.
Youth ministry approach. Yeah. Before intergenerational, we hadn't heard about intergenerational before, but the way it happened for us is young adults were actually wanting to be friends in an appropriate way with younger people, obviously with safe ministry standards around as well. But we actually had a situation where, for example, we stopped drinking on a Saturday night so young people who were underage could hang out with us in appropriate ways. And so, that led to teenagers and young adults starting to be friends with each other, that then broadened and broadened and broadened. So that was a third approach in Sydney that was only just at one church. It wasn't broad too much. But then sooner or later, Menai Anglican Church wanted to kind of experiment with this community idea, and so did Narrabeen Anglican Church. And to this day, I think Narrabeen Anglican Church is still called Solies, because I think they got their name from when three of our churches were really good friends in the 90s. So I think that one thing that I'm a bit worried about these days is there doesn't seem, I do appreciate what Andy was saying, that, one of the downsides of having different models of youth ministry is there can be a bit of argumentative interaction can generate. But I think youth ministry is more than just principles of youth ministry, because I think that there are different models of doing things, and those different models are responding to the change in culture. And I think it's good for grassroots models to come up from the grassroots, and for us to interact with each other and give young youth leaders today the opportunity to think, how am I going to do what new Andrew Callow ideas are going to come up in this next generation, where someone goes, I might just take a toaster up the school, because that could become, in one sense it's a principle. It's like, take your ministry to the school. But the reason I like ideas of models is it gives people an opportunity to create new approaches for the new cultural environment.
And exactly, I would suggest that fits on that evangelical line, that having those discussions and trying to come up with new ideas while still remaining devoted to the clear principles and ideas of the gospel, that's where it needs to happen, and that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay. So as we come to the end of the decade, I think the 90s was a different kind of cultural environment to what happens after 9/11, and I think it'd be really interesting to look at millennials and how 9/11 changed evangelism. But the freedom we had just to share the gospel with others in the 90s was a very exciting thing. The different models that were being thrown around was very exciting as well. And I think if you talk to most of the youth ministers of that decade, they would have a great fondness for each other, even though they had disagreement with each other as well.
And it also feels like you weren't submitting to the culture in terms of like trying to be the coolest. It was kind of like, what's the best way for people to know about Jesus, rather than
that's right.
You weren't selling out.
Actually, that's a funny thought. I hadn't thought of that before, Joel. Actually, like, we didn't want to sell out the gospel. So our generation didn't want to sell out, and we didn't want to sell out the gospel, and we didn't want to sell it out to our culture or to our parents' culture, but we wanted to continue to try and find out what it was to be Christian. And we used to talk about being countercultural, and we used to think that was actually part of that expression.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to wrap it up. So thank you very much. It's been another very learned piece of content that I always like to participate in.
And I think I just want to say, your thoughts about the American context was really helpful, Joel. That's good.
Thank you very much. So next week, something that you've brought up that we need to look into is the emerging church and church planning and things like that, which take us into the 2000s. So we'll talk about that, and also the evangelical movement, which is what Tim is really interested in. So we'll bring him on again next week and discuss that. Having said that, we'll finish up today. If you are really interested in what we're talking about and have any thoughts about it, you can definitely get in contact with me, and we can put it on the podcast like we did with Andrew's questions like last week. And the number of ways you can do that is by emailing me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to our email newsletter, which is on our website, shockabsorber.com.au. Definitely subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet, or on YouTube, because you'll obviously get notified when we've released a new episode. Usually comes out on Monday. And there is a Discord link in the show notes where you can jump on the server and we can continue chatting as well. But once again, thank you very much for listening and or watching us. Thanks for the skateboard, Stu. It's very, very fun. And thanks for being on the podcast. One way.